This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider telling someone about the podcast. If you have a favorite episode or a story that really impacted you, let a friend or a family member know about that. Show them the podcast and show them how they can listen to it in an app. We continue to have the Deconversion Anonymous Tuesday evening hangout after the podcast release. The guest from the previous week generally is available for you to ask further questions. So please join the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guest today is Jenny McGrath. Jenny is a licensed mental health counselor. She works from a trauma-informed perspective, and she has a focus on embodiment. Her particular expertise is for those who have suffered trauma because of purity culture. And as a content warning, we will be talking about the trauma induced by purity culture and religious trauma. Jenny is a part of the Purity Culture Research Collective, and Jenny has a course called Embodied Sexuality that helps people walk through recovery from religious trauma and purity culture trauma. You can find Jenny's website at indwellcounseling.com, as well as finding the Embodied Sexuality course at indwellmovement.com. Here is my conversation with Jenny McGrath. Jenny McGrath, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
I'm glad you're here. I'm going to let you talk more about your credentials, but you're a licensed mental health counselor, and you have focused on purity culture and specifically the embodiment of one's sexuality. You want to give us the 5-minute overview of your work, and we'll dive in deep in a bit, but just the overview here.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm a licensed mental health counselor and I do somatic psychotherapy. So I really help folks integrate kind of more traditional talk therapy with their bodies.
Okay.
A lot of times in psychology, we're looked at as if we're floating heads. And especially in trauma research, what we've seen is that that's not enough. We are deeply embodied beings. And especially when we've experienced trauma, the body just needs to be engaged. And so I do that in different ways, both just through simple breathing exercises and somatic exercises in session. And then I also do classes and courses to help folks understand their connection with their bodies.
That's amazing. Yeah. I know that the kind of the bleeding edge on mental health at this point in time is that recognition that we've kind of ignored the body and that the nomenclature is the trauma is held in the body. Is that the perspective you're coming from?
Absolutely. Yeah. And especially as you mentioned, I work primarily with folks who are working through religious trauma or religious sexual shame.
Okay.
And for many in that world, myself included, most of our life, we were told our body didn't matter or our body was sinful or terrible. And so there's even just so much ingrained messaging and beliefs and disconnect from the body that takes a lot of time to heal and to rediscover what it means to be human, what it means to be a body when we've learned so many skewed messages for a really long time.
Yes, the flesh is evil. The flesh is weak. The flesh.
Right.
There are some definite parallels, with the podcast. The message that I've been trying to get out from the get-go is embracing one's humanity. That includes your physicality, that includes your sexuality, that includes your emotions. And on the other side of the fence, the atheist rationalist side of the fence has been very focused on the brain and the mind as well and ignoring the rest. And so definitely we try to take the whole picture, the whole human being into effect. So you are the perfect guest here.
I love that. Thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah. So what I'd love to start with is a little bit about your story. So I understand that purity culture affected your life as well.
It did, yeah. I grew up in Colorado Springs, and so for a lot of folks who understand fundamental evangelicalism, that might sound like a familiar place.
Yes.
It really was the height of a lot of purity culture rhetoric. Colorado Springs was the birthplace of the original purity balls,
Oh, wow.
and yeah. So I was very steeped in that world, and I am the youngest and the only girl. I have 3 older brothers, and so I think
Okay.
I was uniquely impacted by the messages of purity culture. I think everyone is impacted by the messages of purity culture regardless of gender, and so for me, I really wanted to be good in that system, and I really dedicated my life to it. So much so that when I was 19 years old, I moved to Uganda to be a missionary.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and spent several years there. And it was actually my journey with my body that
Yeah.
kind of started to shift course for me. After a few years, my body really shut down with
Mm.
vicarious trauma, with my own undealt with trauma, and so I wasn't sure if I would be able to go back to Uganda. I actually initially went to grad school to learn how to work in Uganda long term and how to try to make it sustainable. And that was kind of my goal. And then through my grad school experience was where I think for me, I started first questioning race, and what it meant for me as a white woman, as a 19, 20, 21-year-old to step into Uganda as an expert, and why that was okay. And it really started to not become okay for me over the years. And then that really started to unpack a lot more of the systems of white supremacy and Christian supremacy and
Hmm.
how they impact the body. And so I've been in private practice for over 6 years now. And most of the clients that I work with are also on some level either deconstructing or just trying to sort through what they believe versus what they've been told that they should believe most of their lives.
One of the things that I mention fairly often is that I came to Christianity in my late teens, 16 or 17 years old, and I'd already had sexual experiences. I already had kind of a sense of self. And I feel like that protected me from some of the most damaging elements of purity
Totally.
culture.
My
And
first response was
yeah,
lucky.
yeah, exactly. So maybe as a beginning question, then, what are some of the damaging messages that one receives, especially as maybe a person going through puberty within this purity culture?
Totally. I think, purity culture sets up binary rhetoric. And so it has very, very specific gender social norms and
Hmm.
constructs for who are quote unquote men and who are quote unquote women. And so, right off the bat, there is just erasure for folks who are non binary or who are transgender. There really is no languaging for them in
Yeah.
this world. And so, for people who are cisgender men, or who are socialized as men, they receive so many messages that they are out of control animals, that they're not going to be able to control themselves. And they're also, I think the subtext for that is that there's often not a lot of responsibility taught. There's
Right.
not, especially because, purity culture wasn't only in evangelicalism through Reagan and onward, and then through George W. Bush. There was a lot of abstinence only education taught in public schools that was kind of put there because of purity culture. And one of the main tenets of that is this idea that you can't teach kids about consent, because if you teach kids consent, they're going to have sex. So just don't do it. And so what that does is creates another binary of sex or no sex, and
Right.
there is no language for sexual abuse, and there's no language for unwanted sexual contact. And so a lot of times then the messaging that cisgender women or those who are socialized as women hear is that, especially white women, I will add also,
Okay.
this is also very racialized in the system where white women are these bearers of innocence and purity. And young girls, 12, 11, are told, you know, don't dress too sexy. I
Right.
remember in seventh grade, I was lined up in a hallway with a group of girls, and we were 11, and we had to put our arms down. And if our fingertips went below our shorts, we got a detention. And it was just
Yeah.
these like insidious messages all the
Yeah.
time, like your body is dangerous. You
Yeah.
yourself are dangerous. So cover it up. These messages of like frame only your face, make sure like nothing else in your body is appealing. And so it really set up a lot of harm for
Yeah.
obviously
Yeah.
all genders. And then, the flip side of that is that often there was these um, ideas that have a long history in our country as well, where there was no place for women of color within purity culture. Often Black women were socialized, or not socialized, but they were stereotyped as being hypersexual or lascivious. And so purity culture really does emphasize this idea and what this trope of what I call the young white woman,
Okay.
and how there's this really small, rigid idea of what that means and how you are supposed to perform racially and gendered within that system.
Interesting, because I was just listening to a podcast, This is Critical with Virginia Heffernan, where they were discussing public pools. And one of the big racial issues was when they went from gender segregated to gender integrated, was when racism just exploded, and they
Mm.
didn't want to have Black men and white women together in kind of that intimate setting. So let's expound upon that. You've said in your work there's this intersection of sexism and racism, and let's just talk about more about that.
Yeah, definitely. So in my research and my work, I kind of trace the trope of young white women really through early US days. There were the messages that you couldn't rape an enslaved woman because Black women always wanted to have
Oh
sex.
wow.
And so the ways in which white women and Black women were pit against each other, and that always led to disproportionate harm of bodies of color. And what I want folks to also understand is that white women are also harmed in that system.
Sure.
It's a more implicit and subtle harm, but it ends up being a really disembodying experience when your whole life is about how you perform in that system. And so we see this traced through, in 1915, there was the film Birth of a Nation that
Mhm.
had white men in blackface sexually assaulting white women. And after that, we see huge um, uptick in lynchings and in violence against Black communities. And so the ideology of quote unquote protecting young white women
Mm.
has always been used to harm bodies of color in the United States.
Yes, this seems like just one more way in which the systemic racism rears its ugly head in the United States and in Western culture in general. I want to focus a little bit on the impact on women. We've already acknowledged that this affects all genders, all the spectrum of
Mhm.
genders. For boys, it's that boys will be boys, and they're kind of let off the hook and treated as though they are uncontrollable. But for women specifically, there's another level of burden. So you were describing being 11 years old and having to you put your arms down. There's a sexualization of an 11 or a 12-year-old young girl. She hasn't even thought about sexuality yet.
Yes.
Maybe not. But, and suddenly all this sexuality is placed upon her. Do you want to talk about what that is like for young women?
Yeah, absolutely. It's this crazy making experience where you are completely sexualized while you're being told don't be sexual. And so everything about you is about your life, your value, your worth, your future husband hinging on the social construct of your virginity while you're also not receiving comprehensive sex education
Right.
to even understand how virginity itself is a social construct. And so
Right.
there's so many messages that then sever oneself from their body because if I'm in my body, young white women are really taught to be objects of sexuality. We aren't taught to be subjects of sexuality.
Right.
And so, even in a lot of the youth group messaging or the abstinence only, often when there were conversations about masturbation, they were only focused on young boys or young men. And there was never an idea or a thought that that
Yeah.
would be something that young women might want to explore or enjoy. And so a lot of times that compiles this shame for folks who are in a female body and do have a sexual desire. Because in that world, you're taught kind of sex is something you're supposed to endure. It's not really supposed to be something you want or you enjoy. It's really to, keep your husband satisfied. And so when you have your own ideas or fantasies or desires, that becomes so disorienting and so confusing. Even more so if you are not a straight woman and if you're a queer woman and there's no education for that being normalized or okay.
Right.
And so, for most of the folks that I work with and my own journey, a lot of what is kind of the norm is this certain level of dissociation. When I
Okay.
ask my clients, what types of things do you like, whether that's sexual or not, it is a really common phrase that I hear that say, I don't actually know what I
Mm.
want.
Mhm.
Simple things like, do you like pizza? Like there is, and I tell people we don't come into the world not knowing what we like. The first thing we do is scream if we're cold or
Yeah.
hungry or tired or we want to be held. And so we really learned at a super young age often how to disconnect and how to have this affect of everything's fine, I'm okay. And we don't really know what's going on in our insides often.
Yeah, that is amazing. Again, as I mentioned, coming to it late, one of the things that was shocking to me as I started to do these interviews was how much impact this has had on. I'll be talking to a 35-year-old, right? 30-year-old, and you can see the trauma, literally, that they have lived through.
Hmm.
And I just wasn't prepared for that. I was naive. I was ignorant, and it has been an education to talk to people about their experiences.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it was primarily girls who received purity rings or purity balls. I had a purity ring. None of my 3 brothers had a purity ring.
Right.
There was this
Suspiciously so.
totally,
Yeah.
yeah, and so, they're really and we received these when we were 11, 12, 13, often,
Yeah.
without even fully understanding what we were committing to or what we were consenting to because we didn't know. We didn't really have much language for it. And so for a lot of folks, it's kind of just the water we swim in. And
Right.
it is deeply traumatizing, as you're saying. And a lot of folks don't even realize that because it's for those of us who grew up in that world, that's all we knew and that's all we saw modeled. And so it's kind of like, oh, it takes more work to kind of the frog in boiling water, like
Yes.
just
Yeah.
step out and be like, what was that?
Yeah. You've touched on a few times the lack of sex education. It's my understanding that even as it pertains to abortion rates and things like that, that solid sex education, access to reproductive health care, all of those things reduce abortion rates. And yet the abstinence only crowd and the anti abortion crowd do the opposite of that, such that we have, of course, ignorance. Of course, a 16-year-old who's never had sex education has no idea how sex works.
Right.
And so you're going to have unplanned pregnancies. You're going to have that more often because they don't know. They don't know what they don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is the you don't know what you don't know. And also, there's the sense in that world that you can't admit that you want to have sex. So, having a condom on hand is planning that you want
Right.
to have
Yeah.
sex.
Premeditation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's so much more okay, quote unquote, to say, oh my gosh, it just happened. I don't know why. We were just in a room together. But to say, like, yes, I actually put thought into this. This is something I desire.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. The places that have the highest abstinence only education are the places that often have the highest teen pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies,
Mhm.
STI rates, because there isn't information. And usually, abstinence only education is really correlated with access to contraceptives as
Mhm.
well. Places that really value the whole person, including sexuality and providing for that, often have more access to healthy and safe and affordable contraceptives,
Right.
whereas in the United States, we do not.
One other thing, Jenny, that I've heard you talk about is the potential for people to over respond. So they come out of purity culture and they have all this new freedom. And
Mhm.
in some ways, it's like, the person had arrested development, right? And they are coming as an adult, as if they were a teenager, and they can overreact a bit. I wanted to just mention that again, no judgment about this at all, but to say that we also need to be wise about our sexuality.
Totally. Yeah. And it's such a complex area, because hypersexuality can also be a symptom of sexual abuse.
Mhm.
It's one of many ways in which someone who has had experiences where they didn't have agency, they didn't have consent, looks for what we call trauma mastery. And there's kind of this unconscious, visceral sense of maybe this time, maybe this time, maybe this time.
Yeah.
And we really keep trying to find spaces where we feel empowered. And often when we do make disembodied or impulsive choices, that ends up doing the opposite of what we want. And so I love what you said, like no judgment. And I think it starts with understanding it makes sense, either from a trauma lens or even from just a compensatory effect
Yeah. Yeah.
lens
Making up for
that
time,
when
lost time.
totally.
Yeah.
And for some folks, I do think that that can be sort of a delayed developmental stage where we didn't get to have the exploration, the experimentation at ages that we could do that in a smaller, safer community. And so sometimes that might happen later and it might come with more risks. And so that's why I think it's so important for folks to understand how to use protection, how to have conversations about STI status, how to talk about consent and making sure you feel safe with someone, and things that take a little more time to develop. So that can be part of the developmental phase. And then over time, usually that can kind of work itself into a sexuality that feels like it's integrated into all of who the person is.
Jenny, you've mentioned a couple times doing research, and I understand you're a part of the Purity Culture Research Collective. So I wanted you to talk about that. What does that organization do, and what is the research aspect of the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we are a collective of professors, scholars, therapists, artists, activists, a group of folks who came together around this issue
Hmm.
of purity culture. And so, some folks in our group, such as Professor Sarah Mosliner, has written the book Virgin Nation, which is one of kind of the Bibles, if you
Okay.
can say that, for purity culture. Um, and then we have, just folks that are continuing to do ongoing research. And so my aspect of the research comes out of my own experience and out of just this phenomena that I've witnessed, and it's the transnationalizing of purity. And so I was one of many young white women who decided to be missionaries, who
Hmm.
grew up in this world, and especially missionaries in Uganda. That was a very big focus in the early to mid 2000s. And so I'm looking at why. How was the rhetoric and the socialization that we received, how did that prime us when we heard about organizations such as Invisible Children,
Hmm.
that there were, I know so many women. And as I've been telling folks about my research study, one of the most common responses I have is, "That is so weirdly niche, and I just had 12 people come to mind."
Right.
And so
Right. Exactly.
but there are folks, researching all different things like, the intersection of purity culture and eating disorders, the intersection of purity culture and racism, how affect within evangelicalism lends itself to covering up sexual abuse,
Mhm.
looking at crisis pregnancy centers and their correlation with purity culture. It just is such an amazing group that I'm really honored to be a part of.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really exciting.
And then what is the output of that? Do other counselors consume that? Does the academia consume that? Who is the other end of that research
Yeah, so right, for me personally or for the whole
for the
collective?
collective?
Yeah, so it's all very different. So
Okay.
some of us are professors at universities, and so their research goes to their students, to their publications. Some are artists, and their work goes to whoever gets to see that and witness that. Those of us who are therapists, that ends up being one of our specialties. We do have kind of an offshoot of the Purity Culture Research Collective is the Post Purity Healing Project.
Okay.
And so that is compiling different healers and therapists or body workers who are helping folks who experienced purity culture. Because part of our collective is this funny, niche, really specific thing that actually, the more we dive into, really touched so many people, whether they grew up in evangelicalism or not. And so we're still young, we're a couple years old, but still learning like how and what we can contribute to those who were impacted. So it's all very exciting.
Yeah, very cool. You say something that's really important there, that obviously we are focusing on the Christian aspect of this, but honestly, it's kind of Victorian era sexual politics that have been around for a very
Totally.
long time. And it is,
Hmm.
if you think of kind of all the tropes of the 50s, that young people just weren't educated about sexuality and
Yeah.
were making mistakes as they went along. So you could imagine people that are older in their 60s, 70s that could still have been affected by this purity culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I often like to point out is that our first permanent settlement was Virginia, named after the virginal status of the
Right.
queen.
Yes.
And there's just this
Yeah.
long obsession.
Point well made.
And yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's turn to more of your particular practice. I understand that you have a project, for lack of a better term, called Sexual Embodiment or Embodiment. Why am I saying this wrong?
The Embodied Sexuality
Okay.
course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. You have the Embodied Sexuality course, and I want to delve into that. What is that like? What would a participant experience if they went through that?
For sure. Yeah. The Embodied Sexuality course really came out of over 6 years of having different and very similar conversations with my clients around their bodies, around understanding why we were
Right.
socialized the way that we were socialized. And so the embodied sexuality course really is what I would say is more of a process course. So I think there are courses out there that are very content oriented, and this course does have a ton of content, but it is really emphasizing allowing someone to be in the process of engaging the course material. And it's not therapy. It doesn't put me in a therapeutic relationship with someone,
Okay.
but I have created the course out of the therapeutic relationships that I've had for the last 6 years to really help folks get to go through unpacking the impacts of purity culture, of abstinence only education on their bodies, on their lives, on their communities. And so there's 9 different modules that include, one is a 90-minute lecture with a ton of reading about the history of purity. Like we were just saying, these old tropes that you can trace back for thousands of years. Because I think it's so important for folks to understand our sexuality doesn't exist in a vacuum. There
Hmm.
are reasons that we feel the way we do about what we like, what we don't like. And often those are because of external messages, not actually because of the way that we feel.
Right.
And so then I also have modules on trauma and understanding how sexual abuse and sexual trauma impact our relationship to our body and our sexuality. There's a module on pleasure and exploring what that looks like, especially for female bodied folks who
Hmm.
never had that curiosity, or not that they didn't have that curiosity, it just wasn't allowed
It was
in a lot of
suppressed. Yeah.
circles.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's really meant to be a fully comprehensive, I call it the sex education we never received, plus a lot more, plus kind of helping understand, you know, why and how these racist and sexist ideas have been so strong. And I always view healing not as just individual. I think, especially as white bodied folks, our healing needs to always look at how we've also been complicit in systems of harm. And so this course is really about individual healing and collective liberation. How do we allow ourselves to become more free in service of a world that's more free, that allows all bodies to feel safe and free?
Jenny, I've had multiple people ask me to do a podcast on purity culture, and I've been super nervous about doing it because I've seen it done wrong, right? I've seen it
Mm,
done
mhm.
that overreaction side of things. And so I really appreciate the expertise that you have brought to this subject and the matter of fact way that we can discuss sexuality. I think that in itself is just a model that sexuality is such a normal part of being a human being. We can talk about it in a normal way. And I've just really appreciated that.
Yes.
I want to give you a
Yeah,
moment
thank
to
you.
let people know how they can reach out to you, how, maybe as a counselor, but also how to be a part of the embodiment course.
Yeah, for sure. So my counseling website is indwellcounseling.com. And then the course website is indwellmovement.com.
Okay.
And one thing I want to say about the course, if that's all right, is
Yes.
that it is our highest priority that the course get to as many folks that need it. And so while the course is priced for the value because of the dozens of hours of content, much less the hundreds of hours that went into it, we are committed that anybody who wants the course will have access to it, and not be prohibited due to lack of funds. So just want to put that out there for folks who've heard our conversation today and think this sounds really like something I need. Feel free to go to indwellmovement.com, and let me know if there is anything I can do to help you in your process and your journey of healing, because I think it's so important and so valuable.
Jenny McGrath, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Final thoughts on the episode. As I said there at the end, I am very thankful to Jenny for coming on and discussing the topic of purity culture and sexuality and embodied sexuality. This is a topic that has been requested on a number of occasions, and I've really been looking for the right person to come and talk to us about that. So I really appreciate the expertise that she brought to the conversation. I want to give a shout out as well to the Purity Culture Research Collective and the work that they are all doing. I think that's amazing work. I think it's an understudied area, as well as religious trauma in general. And what Jenny is doing and what the collective is doing is amazing work. I really appreciated Jenny's matter-of-fact discussion about sexuality, about purity culture, about the trauma that is induced from purity culture. To quote Jenny, "These insidious messages, your body is dangerous, you are dangerous, cover it up." Another quote from Jenny, "Purity culture for young women is this crazy-making experience. You are completely sexualized while being told, don't be sexual." And my heart is broken as usual to hear about the way that particularly young women, but people within fundamentalist religious contexts in general and the purity culture experience, the trauma that a person experiences, what that would do to a person going through puberty, going through their teenage years is just devastating. And my heart is broken for those of you who have suffered through that. Jenny also represents hope, though, that we can reclaim our bodies, we can reclaim our sexuality, reclaim our autonomy and individuality, and move forward and progress and work through these things. I also appreciated Jenny's unpacking of the intersection of sexism, purity culture, and racism, and how that has impacted historically disparaged groups of people, as well as the myths around young white female purity and the paternalistic protection of young white women, but the damage that that does not only to the people of color, but also the young white women themselves. So I really appreciated her highlighting that and digging into that as well. The quote of the conversation has to be, and this is quoting Jenny, "Women are really taught to be the objects of sexuality. We are not taught to be the subjects of sexuality." I think that really hit me the most as a heterosexual man, having lived within the Christian context, and that subjectivity never being in doubt. The boys will be boys, excuses, and the focus of men as being the subjects and the women as being objects. And again, to experience that autonomy of becoming your own self as a woman and taking over your own sexuality and your own body has got to be one of the greatest elements of deconstruction and deconversion. Jenny was absolutely the perfect guest to discuss purity culture, and I really, really appreciate what she brought to the table here. You can find Jenny at indwellcounseling.com, and you can find her Embodied Sexuality course at indwellmovement.com. And of course, we will have those links in the show notes. I want to thank Jenny for being on the podcast and bringing her expertise and giving us some hope that we can overcome the messages that we may have internalized and we can be a whole human being at the other end. Thank you, Jenny, for being on the podcast. The secular grace thought of the week is about embracing the fullness of our humanity. That includes our sexuality, our gender, our internal identity, our bodies, our emotions, and all of those things holistically make us a human being. And it is a continual process of embracing that and deconstructing and jettisoning the messages that tell us that any part of ourselves is bad or unrighteous or less than human in any way. This truly is the message of the podcast, that almost all religious traditions, we tend to focus on Christianity because it is a super easy target, but virtually all of them diminish one's humanity in one way or another. You've heard me be critical even of meditation in the past, and my reason for that is that people talk about meditation as if they are doing it wrong. They will say things like, I love to meditate, but I'm not very good at it. What I want to get across to you is that any message that suggests that you are not good enough isn't true. The entire point is that when we accept our humanity, accept ourselves for who we are, to give ourselves secular grace, this enables us to recognize these insidious messages that are just not true, because we are no longer seeing ourselves as incomplete, unrighteous, unhealthy, unfit. All of these messages are to the detriment of our own humanity. And the simple message of you are a human being and that deserves dignity, respect, love, community, and self-respect. And if you can get a handle on that, you begin to see all the other messages that would suggest otherwise then become obvious and easy to reject and get rid of. My hope for you is that you embrace your own humanity and let go of the baggage of the past. That is the end goal of deconstruction and deconversion. Next week, we have Adria. Adria's expertise is in international development and education, and she reached out to me because we've had so many missionaries on. She wanted to challenge the idea of missionary work and the inherent racism that is underneath that, and the audacity, much like what Jenny recognized in herself, of traveling to another country and suggesting that you know more than the local people know. So look forward to that next week. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.